The sun hung low over the prairie that afternoon, casting long shadows across the golden wheat that stretched as far as the eye could see. And Martha knew her time was running short. She'd been walking for 3 days now, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the shame that weighed heavier than any burden she had ever carried. And her feet were bloodied and her throat was parched. But still she pushed forward because there was nowhere else to go. The ranch house appeared like a mirage, at first just a dark shape against the endless sky. But as she drew closer, she could make out the weathered wood and the thin line of smoke rising from the chimney, and something in her chest loosened just a little. Because where there was smoke, there were people, and where there were people there might be mercy. She collapsed at the edge of the property near an old water trough, and that was where Thomas found her. He had been mending fence posts when he saw her crumpled form, and at first, he thought it might be a coyote or perhaps a calf that had wandered too far from its mother. But as he approached, he saw the fabric of her dress and the dark hair spilling across the dry earth, and he quickened his pace. Thomas was 63 years old, and he had seen much in his lifetime, and not all of it had been kind. But somewhere along the way he had learned that how a man responds to suffering says more about him than any words he might speak in church on Sunday. He knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder, and Martha's eyes fluttered open, filled with fear and exhaustion. "Please," she whispered, and her voice was like dry leaves scraping against stone. "Please don't send me away." Thomas said nothing at first, and he noticed the way she clutched the cloth wrapped around her legs and the dark stains that had seeped through, and he understood without asking that she was hurt, and that the hurt went deeper than what could be seen. "Let me help you," he said quietly, and his voice carried the weight of all his years, the gentleness that comes only from having known real hardship. Martha shook her head and tears began to stream down her dusty cheeks, and she pulled the cloth tighter around herself. "Don't take the cloth off," she begged, and her whole body trembled with the plea. "Don't look at it, please. Just give me some water and let me rest in your barn, and I'll be gone by morning. I promise. I'll be gone." Thomas studied her face, and he saw something there that reminded him of a deer he had once found caught in wire fencing years ago, and the animal had fought him even as he tried to free it, because fear makes us unable to recognize kindness when it appears. He stood slowly and removed his hat and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "My name is Thomas Holloway, and this is my land, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no calculation, just a simple statement of fact. "But I need to see what's wrong with your leg so I can help you properly. And I give you my word as a man who has stood before God and buried a wife and raised 3 children and made more mistakes than I can count, that I will treat you with nothing but respect." Martha looked up at him, and something in his weathered face made her want to believe and want to trust, but the shame was so heavy and so deeply rooted that she couldn't find the words. "My husband," she began, and then stopped and started again. "He found out about the baby, and it wasn't his, and he took a hot poker from the fire, and he branded me like cattle, and then he threw me out and told me if I ever came back he'd finish what he started." Her voice broke on the last words, and she buried her face in her hands, and her shoulders shook with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, and it was the same feeling he had experienced when his youngest daughter had come to him at 16 and told him she was pregnant and afraid, and he had held her and told her that love doesn't abandon people when they need it most. He knelt down again, and this time he placed his hat on the ground beside him. "Martha," he said softly, using her name though. She hadn't yet told it to him, sensing somehow that she needed to hear herself called by something other than the names her husband had likely used those last terrible days. "I'm going to pick you up now and carry you to the house and my daughter-in-law. Sarah is there, and she's a good woman, and she'll help me tend to your wounds, and nobody is going to hurt you and nobody is going to judge you, and you can stay here until you're healed and maybe longer if you want. But I need to take that cloth off because infection is a cruel thing, and I won't let it take you when you've already survived so much." Martha looked into his eyes, and she saw no disgust there, and no cruelty, just a deep well of human kindness that she had forgotten existed in the world. And slowly she nodded. Thomas lifted her as gently as he would a child, and she was surprised by how strong he still was, despite his age, and as he carried her toward the house, She felt something shift inside her like ice beginning to thaw. After a long winter, Sarah met them at the door and her eyes widened when she saw Martha. But she asked no questions and simply hurried to prepare the guest room and bring clean water and bandages and all the things that might be needed. They laid Martha on the bed and Sarah stood by with her hand resting gently on Martha's shoulder, while Thomas carefully unwound the cloth from her legs. What he saw made his jaw tighten and his hands pause for just a moment because the burns were severe and deliberate, and they formed letters that spelled out words no person should ever have carved into their flesh. Sarah drew in a sharp breath, but she didn't look away, and neither did Thomas. "Well," Thomas said after a long moment, his voice steady, despite the anger that burned in his chest. "We've got work to do, and Sarah, you remember when young Billy got burned by that overturned lantern 2 summers back?" Sarah nodded and squeezed Martha's shoulder. "I remember, and we saved his leg, and we'll save yours too, honey. And you just rest now and let us take care of things." Over the following weeks, Martha healed slowly, and the physical wounds began to close, though the marks would remain forever, and Thomas and Sarah tended to her with a patience that seemed inexhaustible. Thomas would sit by her bedside in the evenings after the day's work was done, and he would tell her stories about his life and his mistakes and the things he had learned. "I wasn't always a kind man," he told her one night, as the lamp flickered and cast dancing shadows on the walls. "When I was young, I was hard and I judged people quickly, and I thought I knew right from wrong as clearly as I knew day from night. And then life taught me different. My wife Elizabeth, she got sick about 15 years back, and the doctor said it was something in her mind, not her body. And she would have spells where she didn't recognize me or the children, and sometimes she would say terrible things, and sometimes she would hurt herself. Folks in town started talking, and they said maybe we should send her away to one of those hospitals, and some of them stopped visiting and treated us like we carried some kind of plague. But my Elizabeth, she was still in there somewhere. And I loved her, not because she was perfect, but because she was mine, and because love isn't something you only give when it's convenient." She died 5 years later, and near the end, she had a moment of clarity, and she looked at me and said, "Thomas, you're a better man than you were, and I know it cost you to become that way, and I'm sorry." And I said, "Don't be sorry, because you taught me what matters." He paused and looked at Martha. "What matters is showing up for people when they're broken and not asking them to be anything other than what they are in that moment, and trusting that with time and kindness they'll find their way back to themselves." Martha wiped tears from her eyes. "How do you find your way back when you're marked like this?" she asked, and her voice was small. "When everyone who sees you will know what you did." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "They'll know something happened to you," he said finally, "but they won't know your whole story unless you choose to tell it. And even then they won't know what it felt like to be you in that moment when choices were made. We all carry marks, Martha, and some of them just happen to be visible. And the people worth knowing are the ones who see past the marks to the person underneath." As the weeks turned into months, Martha grew stronger, and she began to help around the ranch, doing small tasks at first and then more as her legs allowed. She learned that Thomas had 2 sons, and both had moved to different states for work, but they called regularly and sent letters, and that Sarah was married to a man named James who worked the ranch alongside Thomas. She learned that the community was small and tightly knit, and that Thomas was respected not because he was wealthy or powerful, but because he had a reputation for fairness and for helping neighbors when they needed it. One Sunday morning, Sarah asked Martha if she would like to go to church with them. Martha's immediate reaction was panic. "I can't," she said, and the old fear rose in her throat. "They'll all stare and they'll know." Sarah sat down beside her at the kitchen table. "Some will stare," she admitted, "because people are curious, and some will whisper because people talk. But Thomas has already spoken to Pastor John and told him you're staying here and that you're to be treated with respect, and Pastor John is a good man, and he made it clear to the congregation. You don't have to go if you're not ready, but you also don't have to hide forever." Martha thought about this for a long time, and finally she nodded. "I'll go," she said, and her voice shook, but there was determination there too. The church was a simple white building with a steeple that reached toward the prairie sky, and when Martha walked in on Thomas's